4 women, 4 cities, 1 invisible predator. In Montreal, student Amélie Durand vanished without a trace. In Calgary, nurse Hannah McKenzie disappeared from her locked apartment. In Ottawa, marketing assistant Sophie Leclerc was erased overnight. And in Toronto, young professional Rachel Bennett became the 4th victim of a chilling pattern. Their belongings were left behind, their doors sealed from the inside, but their lives were stolen by someone calculating, methodical, and unseen. This is the story of a predator who turned Canada's image of safety into a lie, proof that danger hides where you least expect it. On a biting winter morning in Toronto, the silence of a suburban street was broken by flashing police lights and the crunch of heavy boots on snow. Residents wrapped in coats and scarves gathered in confusion as uniformed officers moved in and out of a modest brick apartment building. Something terrible had happened in the night, something that turned an ordinary neighborhood into the center of a growing nightmare. Inside one of the apartments lived a young woman who was suddenly gone without explanation. She had been seen just the day before, carrying groceries, smiling politely at a neighbor who held the door open for her. By evening, she vanished. Her disappearance was discovered when she failed to show up for work, and her colleagues, alarmed by her absence, contacted the authorities. The officers who entered her apartment were immediately struck by how untouched everything appeared. Her handbag was resting on the kitchen counter, her winter boots neatly placed by the door, and her phone still charging by the bedside. Even more disturbing, the door was locked from the inside as if no one had left. The scene suggested she had simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next. For the people living nearby, the situation was more than unsettling. It was terrifying. This was a neighborhood where children played hockey on the frozen sidewalks and families shoveled each other's driveways. The idea that someone could vanish without a trace in the safety of their own home shattered the fragile comfort people held about their community. Parents pulled their children closer. Neighbors stopped casually chatting in the halls, and every sound in the night seemed sharper, more threatening than before. Detectives began their work carefully, combing through every corner of the apartment for signs of forced entry or struggle. There were none. The windows were sealed shut, and the locks showed no damage. Dust along the sills was undisturbed, ruling out the possibility of an intruder climbing inside. The absence of physical evidence frustrated the investigators and unsettled them further. It was as though the young woman had been erased by invisible hands. As news of the case spread, reporters arrived, crowding the snowy street with cameras and microphones. The story of the missing woman became a headline that echoed across the city, feeding a sense of unease. People wanted answers, but all they received were more questions. Rumors began to circulate. Some suggested she had staged her own disappearance, others whispered about something darker, a hidden presence in Toronto that preyed on the unsuspecting. The police, careful with their words, only confirmed that the situation was suspicious and ongoing. Behind the scenes, detectives were not only troubled by the vanishing itself, but by the eerie precision of it. Whoever was responsible had left nothing behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, not even a footprint in the snow outside. It was the kind of mystery that gnawed at experienced officers, the kind that didn't just point to foul play but to something much more calculated. What began as a single disappearance was already casting a long shadow, one that would soon stretch far beyond this quiet neighborhood. Investigators pored over the details of the Toronto disappearance, hoping to find a thread that could lead them somewhere, anywhere. Days passed without progress until a retired officer working as a consultant noticed something chilling. The locked room mystery was not unique. Over the last 3 years, similar cases had appeared in different Canadian cities. A young student in Montreal, a nurse in Calgary, and a marketing assistant in Ottawa had all gone missing in ways that mirrored the Toronto case. Their apartments were untouched, their belongings left behind, and in every instance, the doors had been secured from the inside. Each case had baffled local authorities, left unsolved, and slowly slipped from the headlines. Now, with a 4th disappearance following the same pattern, it was impossible to dismiss them as isolated tragedies. The realization shook the investigative team. They were no longer dealing with a single missing person case, but a possible serial predator, whose methods defied traditional explanation. Detectives began cross-referencing files, photographs, and evidence logs from the other cities. The more they compared, the clearer the pattern became. The missing women shared no direct connection in their personal lives, but the circumstances of their vanishings were like mirror images. Locked doors, untouched apartments, and no sign of struggle. It was as though the same invisible hand had reached across provinces, pulling each woman out of her life without leaving behind even a trace of resistance. The Canadian public, long comforted by the belief that their country was one of the safest in the world, found itself shaken by the reports. News outlets seized the story, framing it as a wake-up call that safety was not guaranteed, not even in quiet neighborhoods where crime was thought to be rare. Fear spread quickly. Parents reminded their daughters to stay in constant contact. Landlords received panicked calls about upgrading locks, and strangers eyed each other with suspicion on late-night subway rides. The illusion of safety, once so ingrained in daily life, was beginning to fracture. Authorities formed a joint task force, pulling resources from across multiple cities. This was no longer about one missing woman. It was about unraveling a series of disappearances that now appeared connected by design. Profilers were brought in to examine the psychology behind such crimes. Their assessment was grim. Whoever was responsible had planned these abductions with meticulous care. This was not a desperate criminal acting impulsively. It was someone intelligent, calculated, and unnervingly patient. The ability to strike in different provinces without detection suggested mobility and a deliberate effort to stay ahead of the law. What unsettled investigators most was the absence of any ransom demands, threats, or communication. The predator wanted silence. These women were not being taken for money or attention. They were being taken for reasons far darker and more personal. That silence, combined with the locked doors and untouched scenes, created an aura of dread around the cases. How could someone move so freely, bypass locks, erase evidence, and leave no witnesses? It was a question that even seasoned detectives struggled to answer. As winter deepened and the story spread, Canadians began to confront a terrifying possibility. Their safety was not guaranteed, and the threat was not confined to a single city. Somewhere out there, moving unseen, was a predator who treated entire provinces as his hunting ground. Detectives working the task force finally stumbled upon the first sliver of a lead when analysts compared the daily lives of the missing women. At first glance, they seemed to come from very different backgrounds: a university student, a healthcare worker, a marketing assistant, and the young woman from Toronto. Yet a closer look revealed one unnerving similarity. Each of them had recently moved into a new apartment, not through traditional rental agencies, but through the same short-term housing platform that operated across Canada. It was a detail overlooked in the original investigations, but now it stood out like a flashing warning light. This platform required personal information, identification checks, and financial records. Whoever had orchestrated these disappearances had somehow exploited that system. The revelation shifted the investigation dramatically. Detectives obtained warrants and began digging into the platform's data. Their search turned up rental applications tied to identities that didn't exist, names without records, driver's licenses that couldn't be verified, and bank cards connected to phantom accounts. The addresses rented under these false names matched the apartments where the women had last been seen. It became increasingly clear that someone had engineered a digital mask, a series of fake identities used to stalk potential victims without leaving a direct trail back to themselves. Even more chilling was the discovery of security footage from one of the rental buildings. The grainy recording showed a figure moving through the emergency stairwell late at night. The person wore a heavy hood, gloves, and kept their face angled away from every camera. They moved with precision, slipping through exits at times when security guards rotated shifts and hallways were empty. The figure left the building just hours before the tenant vanished. Detectives watched the footage again and again, each time unsettled by how deliberately the intruder avoided detection. This was not a coincidence. This was someone who studied systems, who knew where cameras were placed, who anticipated human routines. The investigators realized they were up against a predator who wasn't just dangerous, but frighteningly intelligent. Traditional criminals left clues: fingerprints, DNA, footprints in the snow. This figure left nothing but a digital shadow and a growing list of victims. Profilers suggested that such planning pointed to someone with a technical background, perhaps in cybersecurity or surveillance, someone who understood how to erase their presence both online and in the physical world. That level of expertise made the case even more daunting. News of the breakthrough leaked to the press, sparking public panic. People who had trusted online platforms to find housing suddenly questioned their safety. Was the stranger renting the apartment next door really who they claimed to be? Fear spread like wildfire, and trust in digital convenience began to erode. For investigators, however, the leak added pressure. They knew publicity might drive the predator deeper underground, but withholding information had already failed to keep people safe. The growing realization was devastating. This was not a random series of crimes, nor was it the work of someone acting on impulse. It was a calculated campaign that stretched across provinces, orchestrated by a person who treated anonymity as their greatest weapon. Canada's image of being a safe and orderly country was unraveling, replaced with a darker truth. Someone was exploiting modern systems to prey on the unsuspecting, and they were always one step ahead of the law. The turning point in the investigation came when a storage unit on the outskirts of Edmonton was flagged during a sweep of suspicious rental records. The unit had been leased under yet another fabricated identity, but this time, the paperwork contained a small clerical error. The listed driver's license number did not match any records in the provincial database, a detail that might have been overlooked had analysts not been scrutinizing every possible lead. Investigators wasted no time in securing a warrant, and when the steel door was lifted, the stale air inside revealed a collection of items that sent shivers down their spines. On the floor sat 4 carefully labeled boxes. Each box contained personal belongings tied to one of the missing women. Jewelry tucked into velvet pouches, photographs of smiling faces, clothing folded neatly as though it had been preserved rather than stolen. The eerie precision of the arrangement made the unit feel less like a hiding place and more like a shrine. These were not trophies hastily taken. They were curated pieces of lives interrupted, tokens that the predator had deliberately chosen to keep. The sense of control of ownership was unmistakable, and it terrified even the most experienced detectives present. Among the belongings lay something even more disturbing: a large corkboard covered with a sprawling map of Canada. Red pins marked the cities already tied to the disappearances: Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Calgary. But investigators quickly noticed dozens of other pins scattered across the country. Some pointed to smaller towns, others to major urban centers. Next to certain pins were handwritten notes, dates, apartment numbers, even specific rental listings. It was clear the predator had been planning meticulously, creating a roadmap of potential future victims. This was not someone acting sporadically. This was a blueprint for a campaign that stretched far beyond the cases already uncovered. The discovery of the map introduced a new level of urgency. If the pins represented intended targets, then the predator was not finished, he was only beginning. Detectives photographed the board, logged every detail, and cross-referenced the rental listings with the housing platform records. What they found was even more unsettling. Several of the apartments marked on the map were currently occupied by young women living alone, each booked through accounts tied to suspicious, unverifiable identities. These tenants had no idea they were living under the gaze of someone who had marked them for disappearance. The task force scrambled to notify and protect those in immediate danger, but they faced another obstacle. The predator already seemed to anticipate law enforcement's moves. Surveillance teams deployed to monitor the listed apartments reported suspicious activity. Doors found ajar, stairwells disturbed, and unfamiliar figures lurking near exits. Yet by the time officers arrived, the intruder was always gone. It was as though someone was studying the investigation in real time, adjusting tactics with every response. The storage unit became the clearest glimpse into the predator's mind, a place where control and obsession intersected. But it also raised haunting questions. How many pins on the map represented lives already lost but unreported? How many represented victims in waiting? And perhaps most troubling, how many steps ahead was this person still operating? The illusion of safety in Canada was collapsing faster than authorities could rebuild it. The predator was not confined to one city or one method. He was mobile, meticulous, and most alarmingly, he was still free. Sense of urgency reached a breaking point when a 5th disappearance was reported, this time in Vancouver. The victim was a 29-year-old graphic designer who had recently relocated from Winnipeg for work. Like the others, She had rented a short-term apartment through the same platform now under investigation. Neighbors recalled seeing her enter the building one evening with a bag of groceries, but by morning she was gone. Her apartment mirrored the other crime scenes, personal belongings untouched, no forced entry, no struggle. The door was locked from the inside. The discovery confirmed what investigators feared most. Despite their growing efforts, the predator was still ahead of them, executing his plan without hesitation. The Vancouver case forced the task force to confront a terrifying reality. Every attempt to anticipate his movements had failed. The map from the storage unit suggested he had already chosen his next locations. Yet even with heightened surveillance in those areas, he managed to strike. Analysts began to suspect he was monitoring police activity, adjusting his timing to avoid capture. Some believed he might even have access to information from within law enforcement circles, though no evidence of a leak could be found. What was certain was that this predator thrived on staying invisible, slipping through gaps in systems that were meant to protect. Public fear spiraled into outrage. News broadcasts ran constant updates, dissecting every known detail, while social media exploded with speculation and panic. Hashtags calling for answers trended nationwide, and politicians faced pressure to explain how such crimes could unfold in a country long celebrated for safety. Safety campaigns that once reassured citizens now rang hollow. Parents no longer trusted letting their children walk to school alone. Tenants began abandoning short-term rentals in droves, fearing they might be the next target. The myth of Canada as a safe haven was unraveling in real time. Behind closed doors, investigators debated how far the predator's reach could extend. The map suggested dozens of potential victims, but the recent escalation hinted that he was moving faster, perhaps emboldened by the attention. The Vancouver victim had vanished mere weeks after the Toronto case, breaking the long pauses between earlier disappearances. It was as though the predator no longer cared about pacing himself. The pattern was evolving into something more aggressive, and that terrified everyone involved. Forensic experts continued scouring the storage unit for any overlooked trace that could lead to his identity, but the results were grim. Every fingerprint had been wiped, every item handled with surgical precision. Even the handwriting on the map offered nothing useful, written with generic pens on standard notepaper. Whoever this was, he knew how to vanish as thoroughly as his victims. The investigation, despite its urgency and resources, remained trapped in the shadows cast by a single meticulous mind. The story closed without resolution, leaving the public haunted by the unanswered questions. Where was the predator now? How many more pins on the map would become real victims before he was stopped? The disappearances proved that danger could thrive even in places believed to be safe, and the image of Canada as a peaceful sanctuary was permanently scarred. The case remained unsolved, an open wound in the nation's sense of security, and a reminder that safety is never absolute.